Who are the men, without our realizing it, give us our ideas, tell us whom to admire and whom to despise, what to believe about the ownership of public utilities, about the tariff, about the price of rubber, about the Dawes Plan, about immigration? Who tells us how our houses should be designed? What furniture should we put in them? What menus we should serve on our table? What kind of shirts we must wear? What sports we should indulge in? What plays we should see? What charities we should support? What jokes we should admire? What slang we should affect? What jokes should we laugh at? If we set out to make a list of the men and women who, because of their position in public life, might fairly be called the molders of public opinion, who could quickly arrive at an extended list of persons mentioned in Who's Who? It would obviously include the President of the United States and the members of his cabinet, the senators and representatives in Congress, the governors of our 48 states, the presidents of the chambers of commerce in our 100 largest cities, the chairman of the boards of directors of our 100 or more unions affiliated in the American Federation of Labor, the national president of each national professional and fraternal organizations, the president of each of the racial or language societies in the country, the 100 leading newspaper and magazine editors, the 50 most popular authors, the presidents of the 50 leading charitable organizations, the 20 leading theatrical or cinema producers, the 100 recognized leaders of fashion, the most popular and influential clergymen in the 100 leading cities, the presidents of our colleges and universities, and the foremost members of their faculties, the most powerful financiers in Wall Street, the most noted amateurs of sports, and so on. Such a list would comprise several thousand persons. But it is well known that many of these leaders are themselves led, sometimes by persons whose names are known to few. Many a congressman, in framing his platform, follow the suggestions of a district boss whom few persons outside the political machine have ever heard of. Eloquent divines may have great influence in their communities, but often take their doctrines from a higher ecclesiastical authority. The presidents of chambers of commerce mold the thought of local businessmen concerning public issues, but the opinions which they promulgate are usually derived from some national authority. A presidential candidate may be drafted in response to overwhelming popular demand, but it is well known that his name may be decided upon by a half-dozen men sitting around a table in a hotel room. In some instances, the power of invisible wire pullers is flagrant. The power of the invisible cabinet which is deliberated at the poker table in a certain little greenhouse in Washington has become a national legend. There was a period in which the major politics of the national government were dictated by a single man, Mark Hanna. A Simmons may, for a few years, succeed in marshalling millions of men on a platform of intolerance and violence. Such persons typify in the public mind the type of ruler associated with the phrase invisible government. But we do not often stop to think that there are dictators in other fields whose influence is just as decisive as that of the politicians I mentioned. An Irene Castle can establish the fashion of short hair which dominates 9/10 of the women who make any pretense to being fashionable. Paris fashion leaders set the mode of the short skirt for wearing which, 20 years ago, any woman would simply have been arrested and thrown into jail by the New York police. And the entire women's clothing industry, capitalized at hundreds of millions of dollars, must be reorganized to conform to their dictum. They are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. It is not generally realized to what extent the words and actions of our most influential public men are dictated by shrewd persons operating behind the scenes, nor, what is still more important, the extent to which our thoughts and habits are modified by authorities. In some departments of our daily life in which we imagine ourselves free agents, we are ruled by dictators exercising great power. A man buying a suit of clothes imagines that he is choosing according to his taste and his personality the kind of garment which he prefers. In reality, he may be obeying the orders of an anonymous gentleman tailor in London. The personage is the silent partner in a modest tailoring establishment, which he patronized by gentlemen of fashion and princes of the blood. He suggests to the British noblemen and others a blue cloth, instead of gray, 2 buttons instead of 3, or sleeves a quarter of an inch narrower than last season. The distinguished customer approves of the idea. But how does this affect John Smith of Topeka? The gentleman tailor is under contract with a certain large American firm which manufactures men's suits to send them instantly designs of the suits chosen by the leaders of London fashion. Upon receiving the designs with specifications as to color, weight, texture, the firm immediately places an order with the cloth makers for several $100,000 worth of cloth. The suits made up according to the specifications and then advertised at the latest fashion. The fashionable men in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia wear them, and the Topeka man recognizes this leadership does the same. Women are just as subject to the commands of invisible government as are men. A silk manufacturer seeking a new market for its product suggested to make a large manufacturer of shoes that women's shoes should be covered with silk to match their dresses. The idea was adopted and systematically propagandized. A popular actress was persuaded to wear the shoes, the fashion spread. The shoe firm, ready with the supply to meet the created demand, and the silk company was ready with the silk for more shoes. The man who injected this idea into the shoe industry was ruling women in one department of their social lives. Different men rule us in various departments of our lives. There may be one power behind the throne in politics, another in the manipulation of federal discount rate, and another in the dictation of next season's dances. If there were a national invisible cabinet ruling our destinies, it would work through certain group leaders on Tuesday for one purpose and through an entirely different set on Wednesday for another. The idea of invisible government is relative. There may be a handful of men who control the educational methods of the great majority of our schools, yet, another standpoint, every parent is a group leader with authority over his or her children. The invisible government tends to be concentrated in the hands of the few because of the expense of manipulating the social machinery which controls the opinions and habits of the masses. To advertise on a scale which will reach 50 million persons is expensive. To reach and persuade the group leaders will dictate the public's thoughts and actions is likewise expensive. For this reason, there is an increasing tendency to concentrate the functions of propaganda in the hands of the propaganda specialist. This specialist is more and more assuming of distinct place and function in our national life. New activities call for new nomenclature. The propagandist who specializes in interpreting enterprises and ideas to the public, and in interpreting the public to promulgators of new enterprises and ideas, has come to be known by the name of Public Relations Counsel. The new profession of public relations has grown up because of the increasing complexity of modern life and the consequent necessity for making the actions of one part of the public understandable to other sectors of the public. It is due to the increasing dependence of organized power of all sorts upon public opinion. Governments, whether they are monarchical, constitutional, democratic, or communist, depend upon acquiescent public opinion for the success of their efforts, and, in fact, government is only government by virtue of public acquiescence. Industries, public utilities, educational movements, indeed all groups representing any concept or product, whether they are the majority or minority ideas, succeed only because of approving public opinion. Public opinion is the acknowledged partner in all broad efforts. The Public Relations Council, then, is an agent who, working with modern media of communication and the group formations of society, brings an idea to the consciousness of the public. But he is a great deal more than that. He is concerned with courses of action, doctrines, systems, and opinions, and the securing of public support for them. He is also concerned with tangible things such as manufactured or raw products. He is concerned with public utilities, with large trade groups and associations representing entire industries. He functions primarily as an advisor to his client, very much as a lawyer does. A lawyer concentrates on the legal aspects of his client's business. A counsel on public relations concentrates on the public contacts of his client's business. Every phase of his client's ideas, products, or activities which may affect the public or in which the public may have an interest is part of his function. For instance, in the specific problems of the manufacturer, he examines the product, the markets, the way in which the public reacts to the product, the attitude of the employees to the public and towards the product, and the cooperation of the distribution agencies. This means by which the public is appraised of the actions of his client are as varied as the means of communication themselves, such as conversation, letters, the stage, motion picture, the radio, lecture platform, the magazine, the daily newspaper. The Council on Public Relations is not an advertising man, but he advocates advertising where that is indicated. Very often he is called in by an advertising agency to supplement his work on behalf of a client. His work and that of the advertising agency do not conflict with or duplicate each other. His efforts are, naturally, devoted to analyzing his client's problems and making sure that what he has to offer public is something which the public accepts or can be bought to accept. It is futile to attempt to sell an idea or prepare the ground for a product that is basically unsound. For example, an orphan asylum is worried by a falling off in contributions and a puzzling attitude of indifference or hostility on the part of the public. The Council on Public Relations may discover upon analysis that the public, alive to modern sociological trends, subconsciously criticizes the institution because it is not organized on the new cottage plan. He will advise modification of the client in this respect, or a railroad may be urged to put on a fast train for the sake of the prestige which it will lead to the road's name and hence to its stocks and bonds. If the corset makers, for instance, wished to bring their product into fashion again, he would unquestionably advise that the plan was impossible since women have definitely emancipated themselves from the old-style corset. Yet his fashion advisors might report that women might be persuaded to adopt a certain type of girdle which eliminated the unhealthful features of the corset. His next effort is to analyze his public. He studies the group which must be reached and the leaders through whom he may approach these groups. Social groups, economic groups, geographical groups, age groups, doctrinal groups, language groups, cultural groups. All these represent the divisions through which, on behalf of his client, he may talk to the public. Only after this double analysis has been made and the results collated has the time come for the next step, the formulation of policies governing the general practice, procedure, and habits of the client in all those aspects in which he comes in contact with the public. And only when these policies have been agreed upon is it time for the fourth step. The first recognition of the distinct functions of the Public Relations Council arose, perhaps, in the early years of the present century as a result of the insurance scandals coincident with the muckraking of corporate finance in the popular magazines. The interests thus attacked suddenly realized that they were completely out of touch with the public they were professing to serve, and required expert advice to show them how they could understand the public and interpret themselves to it. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, prompted by the most fundamental self-interest, initiated a conscious, directed effort to change the attitude of the public towards insurance companies in general, and towards itself in particular, to its profit and the public's benefit. It tried to make a majority movement of itself by getting the public to buy its policies. It reached the public at every point of its corporate and separate existences. To communities, it gave health surveys and expert counsel. To individuals, it gave health creeds and advice. Even the building in which the corporation was located was made a picturesque landmark to see and remember, in other words, to carry on the associative process, and so this company came to have a broad general acceptance. The number and amount of its policies grew constantly as its broad contacts with society increased. Within a decade, many large corporations were employing public relations counsel under one title or another, for they had come to recognize that they depended upon public goodwill for their continued prosperity. It was no longer true that it was none of the public's business how the affairs of a corporation were managed. They were obliged to convince the public that they were conforming to its demands as to honesty and fairness. Thus, a corporation might discover that its labor policy was causing public resentment and might introduce a more enlightened policy solely for the sake of general goodwill. Or a department store hunting for the cause of diminishing sales might discover that its clerks had a reputation for bad manners and initiate formal instruction in courtesy and tact. Relations expert may be known as public relations director or counsel. Often he is called secretary or vice president or director. Sometimes he is known as cabinet officer or commissioner. By whatever title he may be called, his function is well defined, and his advice has definite bearing on the conduct of the group or individual with whom he is working. Many persons still believe that the Public Relations Counsel is a propagandist and nothing else. But, on the contrary, the stage at which many suppose he starts his activities may actually be the stage at which he ends them. After the public and client are thoroughly analyzed and policies have been formulated, his work may be finished. In other cases, the work for the Public Relations Counsel must be continuous to be effective. For in many instances, only a careful system of constant, thorough, and frank information will the public understand and appreciate the value of what a merchant, educator, or statesman is doing. The Council on Public Relations must maintain constant vigilance, because inadequate information or false information from unknown sources may have results of enormous importance. A single false rumor at a critical moment may drive down the price of a corporation stock, causing a loss of millions to stockholders. An air of secrecy or mystery about a corporation's financial dealings may breed a general suspicion capable of acting as an invisible drag on the company's whole dealings with the public. The Council on Public Relations must be in a position to deal effectively with rumors and suspicions, attempting to stop them at their source, counteracting them promptly with correct or more complete information through channels which will be the most effective, or best of all, establishing such relations of confidence in the concerned integrity that rumors and suspicions will have no opportunity to take root. His function may include the discovery of new markets, the existence of which have been unsuspected. If we accept public relations as a profession, we must also expect it to have both ideals and ethics. The idea of the profession is a pragmatic one. It is to make the producer, whether that producer be a legislator making laws or a manufacturer making a commercial product, understand what the public wants, and to make the public understand the objectives of the producer. In relation to industry, the ideal of the profession is to eliminate the waste and the friction that result when industry does things or makes things which its public does not want, or when the public does not understand what is being offered it. For example, the telephone companies maintain extensive public relations departments to explain what they are doing, so that energy may not be burned up in the friction of misunderstanding. A detailed description, for example, of the immense and scientific care which the company takes to choose clearly understandable and distinguishable exchange names, helps the public to appreciate the effort that is being made to give good service, and stimulates it to cooperate by enunciating clearly. It aims to bring about an understanding between educators and educated, between governments and people, between charitable institutions and contributors, between nation and nation. The profession of Public Relations Counsel is developing for itself an ethical code which compares favorably with that governing the legal and medical professions. In part, the code is forced upon the Public Relations Counsel by the very conditions of its work. While recognizing, just as the lawyer does, that everyone has the right to present his case in its best light, he nevertheless refuses a client whom he believes to be dishonest, a product which he believes to be fraudulent, or a case which he believes to be antisocial. One reason for this is that, even though a special pleader, he is not dissociated from the client in the public's mind. Another reason is that while he is pleading the case before the court of public opinion, he is at the same time trying to affect that court's judgments and actions. In law, the judge and jury hold a deciding balance of power. In public opinion, the Public Relations Counsel is judge and jury, because through his pleading of a case, the public may accede to his opinion and judgment. He does not accept a client whose interests conflict with those of another client. He does not accept a client whose case he believes to be hopeless, or whose conduct and product he believes to be unmarketable. He should be candid in his dealings. It must be repeated that his business is not to fool or hoodwink the public. If he were to get such a reputation, his usefulness in his profession would be at an end. When he is sending out propaganda material, it is clearly labeled as to source. The editor knows from whom it comes and what its purpose is, and accepts or rejects it on its merits as news. The systematic study of mass psychology revealed to students the potentialities of invisible government of society by manipulation of the motives which actuate man in the group. Trotter and Laban, whom approached the subject in a scientific manner, and Graham Wallace, Walter Lippmann, and others who continued researching studies of the group mind, established that the group has mental characteristics distinct from those of the individual and is motivated by impulses and emotions which cannot be explained on the basis of what we know of individual psychology. So the question naturally arose, if we understand the mechanisms and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least up to a certain point and within certain limits. Mass psychology is as yet far from being an exact science, and the mysteries of human motivation are by no means all revealed. But at least theory and practice have combined with sufficient success to permit us to know that in certain cases we can effect some change in public opinion with a fair degree of accuracy by operating a certain mechanism, just as the motorist can regulate the speed of his car by manipulating the flow of gasoline. Propaganda is not a science in a laboratory sense, but is no longer entirely the empirical affair that it was before the advent of the study of mass psychology. It is now scientific in the sense that it seeks to base its operations upon definite knowledge drawn from direct observation of the group mind, and upon the application of principles which have been demonstrated to be consistent and relatively constant. The modern propagandist studies systematically and objectively the material in which he is working in the spirit of the laboratory. If the matter in hand is a nationwide sales campaign, he studies the field by means of a clipping service, or of a corps of scouts, or by a personal study at a crucial spot. He determines, for example, which features of a product are losing their public appeal and in what new direction the public taste is veering. He will not fail to investigate to what extent it is the wife who has the final word in the choice of her husband's car, or of his suits and shirts. Scientific accuracy of results is not to be expected, because many of the elements of the situation must always be beyond his control. He may know with a fair degree of certainty that under favorable circumstances an international flight will produce a spirit of goodwill, making possible even the consummation of the political programs. But he cannot be sure that some unexpected event will not overshadow his flight in the public interest, or that some other aviator may not do something more spectacular the day before. Even in his restricted field of public psychology, there must always be a wide margin of error. Propaganda, like economics and sociology, can never be an exact science for the reason that it is subject matter. Like theirs, deals with human beings. If you can influence leaders either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. But men do not need to be actually gathered together in a public meeting or in a street riot to be subject to the influences of mass psychology, because man is by nature gregarious. He feels himself to be a member of a herd even when he is alone in his room with the curtains drawn. His mind retains the patterns of which have been stamped on it by the group influences. A man sits in his office deciding what stocks to buy. He imagines, no doubt, that he is planning his purchases according to his own judgment. In actual fact, his judgment is a melange of impressions stamped on his mind by outside influences which unconsciously control his thought. He buys a certain railroad stock because it is in the headlines yesterday, and hence is the one which comes out most prominently to his mind. Because he has a pleasant recollection of a good dinner on one of its fast trains, because it has a liberal labor policy, a reputation for honesty, because he has been told that J.P. Morgan owns some of its shares. Trotter and Laban concluded that the group mind does not think in the strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits, and emotions. In making up its mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This one is one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology. It operates in establishing the rising or diminishing prestige of a summer resort, in causing a run on a bank or a panic on the stock exchange, in creating a bestseller or a box office success. But when the example of the leader is not at hand and the herd must think for itself, it does so by means of cliches, pat words, or images which stand for a whole group of ideas or experiences. Not many years ago, it was only necessary to tag a political candidate with the word interests to stampede millions of people into voting against him, because anything associated with the interests seemed necessarily corrupt. Recently, the word Bolshevik has been performed a similar service for persons who wish to frighten the public away from a line of action. By playing upon an old cliche or manipulating a new one, the propagandist can sometimes swing a whole mass of group emotions. In Great Britain during the war, the evacuation hospitals came in for a considerable amount of criticism because of the summary way in which they handled their wounded. It was assumed by the public that a hospital gives prolonged and conscientious attention to its patients. When the name was changed to evacuation posts, the critical reaction vanished. No one expected more than an adequate emergency treatment for an institution so named. The cliché hospital was indelibly associated in the public mind with a certain picture to persuade the public to discriminate between one type of hospital and another. To dissociate the cliché from the picture it evoked would have been an impossible task. Instead, a new cliché automatically conditioned the public emotion towards these hospitals. Men are rarely aware of the real reasons which motivate their actions. A man may believe that he buys a motor car because, after careful study of the technical features of all makes of the market, he has concluded that this is the best. He is almost certainly fooling himself. He bought it perhaps because a friend whose financial acumen he respects bought last week, or because his neighbors believed he was not able to afford a car of that class, or because its colors and those of his college fraternity. It is clearly the psychologists of the school of Freud who have pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires which he has been obliged to suppress. A thing may not be desired for its intrinsic worth or usefulness, but because he has unconsciously come to see it in a symbol of something else, the desire for which he is ashamed to admit himself. A man buying a car may think he wants it for purposes of locomotion, whereas the fact may be that he would really prefer not to be burdened with it and would rather walk for the sake of his health. He may really want it because it is a symbol of social position and evidence of his success in business, or a means of pleasing his wife. The general principle that men are very largely actuated by motives which they conceal for themselves is as true as mass as of individual psychology. It is evident that the most successful propagandists must understand the true motives and not be content to accept the reasons which men give for what they do. It is not enough to understand only the mechanical structure of society, the groupings and cleavages and loyalties. An engineer may know about all the cylinders and pistons of a locomotive, but unless he knows how steam behaves under pressure, he cannot make his engine run. Human desires are the steam which makes the social machine work. Only by understanding them can the propagandist control the vast, loose-jointed mechanism which is modern society. The old propagandist based his work on the mechanistic reaction psychology then in vogue in our colleges. This assured that the human mind was merely an individual machine, a system of nerves and nerve centers reacting with mechanical regularity to stimuli, like a helpless, will-less automation. It was the special pleader's function to provide the stimulus which would cause the desired reaction in the individual purchaser. It was one of the doctrines of the reaction psychology that a certain stimulus, often repeated, would create a habit or that the mere reiteration of an idea would create a conviction. Suppose the old type of salesmanship acting for a meat packer was seeking to increase the sale of bacon. It would reiterate innumerable times in full-page advertisements, eat more bacon because it is cheap, because it is good, because it gives you reserve energy. The newer salesmanship, understanding the group structure of society and the principles of mass psychology, would first ask, who is it that influences the eating habits of the public? The answer obviously is the physicians. The new salesman will then suggest to physicians to say publicly that it is wholesome to eat bacon. He knows as a mathematical certainty that large numbers of persons will follow the advice of their doctors because he understands the psychological reaction of dependence of men upon their physicians. The old-fashioned propagandists, using almost exclusively the appeal of the printed word, try to persuade the individual reader to buy a definite article immediately. This approach is exemplified in the type of advertisement which used to be ideal from the point of view of directness and effectiveness. You! Buy O'Leary's rubber heels, now! The advertiser sought by means of reiteration and emphasis directed upon the individual to break down or penetrate sales resistance. Although the appeal was aimed at 50 million persons, it was aimed at each as an individual. The new salesmanship has found it possible, by dealing with men in the mass, through their group formations, to set up psychological and emotional currents which will work for him. Instead of assaulting sales resistance by direct attack, he's interested in removing sales resistance. He creates circumstances which will swing emotional currents so as to make for purchaser demand. If, for instance, I want to sell pianos, it is not sufficient to blanket the country with direct appeals such as, you, buy a Mozart piano now. It is cheap. The artists use it. It will last for years. The claims may all be true, but they are in direct conflict with the claims of other piano manufacturers and in direct competition with the claims of a radio or a motor car, each competing for the customer's dollar. What are the true reasons why the purchaser is planning to spend his money on a new car instead of on a new piano? Because he has decided that he wants the commodity called locomotion more than he wants the commodity called music. Not altogether. He buys a car because it is now the group custom to buy cars. The modern propagandist therefore sets to work to create circumstances which will modify that custom. He appeals perhaps to the home instinct which is fundamental. He will endeavor to develop public acceptance of the idea of a music room in the home. This he may do, for example, by organizing an exhibition of period music rooms designed by well-known decorators who themselves exert influence on the buying groups. He enhances the effectiveness and prestige of these rooms by putting in them rare and valuable tapestries. Then, in order to create dramatic interest in the exhibit, he stages an event or ceremony. To this ceremony, key persons known to influence the buying habits of the public, such as a famous violinist, a popular artist, and a society leader, are invited. These key persons affect other groups, lifting the idea of the music room to a place in the public consciousness which it did not have before. The juxtaposition of these leaders and the idea which they are dramatizing are then projected to a wider public through various publicity channels. Meanwhile, influential architects have been persuaded to make the music room an integral architectural part of their plans, with perhaps especially charming niche in which one corner for the piano. Less influential architects will, as a matter of course, imitate what is done by the men whom they consider masters of their profession. They in turn will implant the idea of the music room in the mind of the general public. The music room will be accepted because it has been made the thing. And the man who has a music room or has arranged a corner of the parlor as a musical corner will naturally think of buying a piano. It will come to him as his own idea. Under the old salesmanship, the manufacturer said to the prospective purchaser, "Please buy a piano." The new salesmanship has revised the process and caused the prospective buyer to say to the manufacturer, "Please sell me a piano." The value of the associative processes in propaganda is shown in connection with a large real estate development. To emphasize that Jackson Heights was socially desirable, every attempt was made to produce this associative process. A benefit performance of the Jitney Players was staged for the benefit of earthquake victims of Japan under the auspices of Mrs. Astor, and others. The social advances of the place were projected. A golf course was laid out and a clubhouse planned. When the post office was opened, the Public Relations Council attempted to use it as a focus for national interest and discovered that its opening fell coincident with a date important in the annals of the American Postal Service. This was then made the basis of the opening. When an attempt was made to show the public the beauty of the apartments, a competition was held among interior decorators for the best furnished apartment in Jackson Heights. An important committee of judges decided this competition drew the approval of well-known authorities, as well as the interest of millions who were made cognizant of it through newspaper and magazine and other publicity, with the effect of building up the prestige of the development. One of the most effective methods is the utilization of the group formation of modern society in order to spread ideas. An example of this is the nationwide competitions for sculpture in ivory soap, open to school children in certain age groups as well as professional sculptors. A sculptor of national reputation found ivory soap an excellent medium for sculpture. The Procter & Gamble Company offered a series of prizes for the best sculptor in white soap. The contest was held under the auspices of the Art Center of New York City, an organization of high standing in the art world. School superintendents and teachers throughout the country were glad to encourage the movement as an educational aid for schools. Perhaps practice among school children as part of their art courses was stimulated. Contests were held between schools, between school districts, and between cities. Ivory soap was adaptable for sculpturing in the homes because mothers saved the shavings and the imperfect efforts of laundry purposes. The work itself was clean. The best pieces are selected from the local competitions for entry in the national contest. This is held annually at an important art gallery in New York, whose prestige with that of the distinguished judges establishes the contest as a serious art event. In the first of these national competitors, about 500 pieces of sculpture were entered. In the third, 2,500, and in the fourth, more than 4,000. If the carefully selected pieces were so numerous, it is evident that a vast number of sculptures during the year, and that a much greater number must have been made for the purposes of practice. The goodwill was greatly enhanced by the fact that this soap had become not merely the concern of the housewife, but also a matter of personal and intimate interest to her children. A number of familiar psychological motives were set in motion in the carrying out of this campaign. The aesthetic, the competitive, the gregarious, the snobbish, the exhibitionist, and last, by no means least, the maternal. All these motives and group habits were put in a concocted and concerted motion by the simple machinery of group leadership and authority. As if actuated by the pressure of a button, people began working for the client for the sake of the gratification obtained in the sculpture work itself. This point is most important in successful propaganda work. The leaders who lend their authority to any propaganda campaign will do so only if it can be made to touch their own interests. There must be a disinterested aspect of the propagandist's activities. In other words, it is one of the functions of these Public Relations Council to discover at what points his client's interests coincide with those of other individuals or groups. In the case of the soap sculpture competition, the distinguished artists and educators who sponsored the idea were glad to lend their services and their names because the competitions really promoted an interest which they had at heart, the cultivation of the aesthetic impulse among the younger generation. Such coincidence and overlapping of interests is as infinite as the interlacing of group formations themselves. For example, a railway wishes to develop its business. The Council on Public Relations makes a survey to discover at what points its interests coincide with those of its prospective customers. The company then establishes relations with chambers of commerce along its right-of-way and assists them in developing their communities. It helps them to secure new plants and industries for the town. It facilitates business through the dissemination of technical information. It is not merely a case of bestowing factors in the hope of receiving favors. These activities of the railroad, besides creating goodwill, will actually promote growth on its right-of-way. The interests of the railroad and the communities through which it passes merely interact and feed one another. In the same way, a bank institutes an investment service for the benefit of its customers in order that the latter may have more money to deposit with the bank, or a jewelry concern develops an insurance department to insure the jewels it sells in order to make the purchaser feel greater security in buying jewels, or a baking company establishing an information service suggesting recipes for bread to encourage new uses of bread in the home. The ideas of the new propaganda are predicted on sound psychology based on enlightened self-interest. I have tried in these chapters to explain the place of propaganda in modern American life and something of the methods by which it operates, to tell the why, the what, the who, and how the invisible government which dictates our thoughts, directs our feelings, and controls our actions. In the following chapters, I shall try to show how propaganda functions in specific departments of group activity to suggest some further ways which it may operate.